My background, if you don't know, is I was a PTA leader for many years. Locally, I was at youth benefit as PTA president for a number of years, and then was on the board for a 4-year term that ended in 2019. And I've been engaged and stayed engaged with HCC PTA during all of that time. I have had some conversations this week and last week with administration about the budget and what is being planned. And I know the superintendent has been really proactive in sharing some of that information at various board meetings and other school system meetings. Essentially, the system has been told, and the county executive has not been shy about indicating that he does not want to continue to fund the school system at its ask. And what is needed is my understanding to fully fund, to keep staff, fully fund negotiated raises with all of our various unions, and stay on top of all of our commitments, both funded and unfunded mandates from the state, would be 60 million over what we got last year. My understanding is that the county executive has indicated in general, he doesn't really want a budget any year that he's in office that is an increase of more than 5% over the prior year. So just essentially to give you some, information about where the budget comes from for the school system, there are 3 funding sources. The state of Maryland, the federal government is the smallest percentage, and it really is limited to Title I money, which is money that's given to school systems with the largest number of students below the poverty level. Money for Child Nutrition Act and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It's very small. I think it represents maybe 4% of the overall budget of the system. The state of Maryland money comes, a significant portion of it comes under the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, which was passed in 2020, I believe. And then the rest of it comes from Harford County. The largest percent of it comes from Harford County. The split is somewhere around 46% the state, and 52% the county. For the last several years, the county has funded nearly flat, and the prior county government before Mr. Castley, while they were suggesting that they were fully funding the operating budget, particularly when I was on the board, what was happening was that they were funding the operating budget, but in cutting the capital budget by the exact amount that they gave to operating above maintenance of effort. And maintenance of effort means there's a state law in Maryland that says you have to fund your school system at least the minimum of what you funded the prior year. And that is often referred to as MOE. You'll see it in the budget in different places that way. That is a state law. So the county government cannot give us less money than it gave us in the prior year in our operating budget, but they're not required to give us more. So you can see from the slide that the county share has decreased from the overall general county budget in the last few years. We were in 2015, almost 41% of the budget. And at this point, we represent 37% of the budget in 2025. Now, this budget is the 2026 budget for the school system. And these are some of the reasons that Harford County Public Schools has been using to explain the decrease in funding. They are taking funds that were previously designated to the school system and putting them in other parts of the county budget. I think that there's going to be an attempt by the school system administration to try to find ways to keep their budget ask within what the county would consider a reasonable ask, just so they could at least get more than flat funding. Our 2024 budget had a decrease in funding, and overall funding, which if you look at all sources. And the 2025 budget showed a very small increase of 2.1%. In addition, the 2025 budget required the school system to use 15.1 million of their fund balance, and fund balance represents money savings from a variety of sources. So it's as if you said in your home budget, I'm going to budget $10,000 this year for utility costs, and your utility costs were 8,000, and then you swept that money into an account, and you came up with a fund balance of $2 million. Some of that fund balance is assigned, meaning that it is associated with obligations that the system has entered into under contracts, and some of it is unassigned. It is generally, according to GAAP, not a good accounting principle to use fund balance to pay ongoing expenses, because that fund balance is not money you can count on a yearly basis or an annual basis. You might have utility savings this year, and next year you might go over utilities based on cost of those items. So to commit them to an ongoing expense like salaries or positions is a very bad accounting practice. So the fact that we had to use fund balance for this current year's budget creates a problem for the school system. It also means we don't have enough savings. If we have an emergency situation, we don't have the money to pay for it. So using fund balance is not an ongoing accounting practice that we want to have to put in place. So before I move on, if anybody has questions, just raise your hand, unmute yourself, shout it out. I don't want to move too quickly. And I also don't want to repeat things that people might already know. So please
Laura,
feel free to participate.
I
Yeah.
had I had a question
Yeah.
on the emergency. So I've heard some people some of the community advocate for using all of the fund balance, and then if there's an emergency, going back to the county to request money for that delta. Like, what's the likelihood of that occurring? Or what do you think impacts of that would be?
Wade, do you want to answer before I do?
Sure.
Let's get, yeah.
Yes. So we haven't had to do that in the past. Um, but I mean, I can give you actually a recent example where it kind of happened. Um, one of our focuses this year, particularly after the shooting in Jobbatown, is school security, and we've needed to ramp up our um, the security measures that are in place around the school system. So um, we are deploying a weapons detection system in all high schools, starting in high schools. And to deploy that, it costs roughly $1 million to do that. Interestingly enough, the Harper County government had just a little over $1 million sitting in a grant that was about to expire at the end of last year, that they had no use for, no way of using. That was able to be used for the purchase of those systems. So you may have heard about the $1 to $1.1 million purchase from that the Harper County government, provided in addition to monies previously, and that came from a federal grant that was about to expire. So that is for instance of being able to get additional funding for very specific needs over time, but in general, it doesn't happen, or it hasn't happened in the past.
So my answer to that, Renee, would be there's a certain amount of autonomy the school system uses if it employs that strategy for dealing with emergency situations, something that HCPS might view as an emergency need might not be something the county executive agrees with, and he could, withhold that funding if he doesn't feel that it's necessary. It's sort of tantamount to saying, going back to your parents after you're, adults and living on your own, and saying, hey, I have no savings, but we need a new roof. How about you give us the money? It just, to me, it's not a responsible way. The whole idea of, the school system has to practice the same accounting principles that any good business does, which is to make sure that they have a sufficient amount of reserves for emergencies, so they're not in a situation where they have to go somewhere with their hand out, and ask for help. So, I would argue it's a terrible practice to spend your fund balance down to zero every year. I don't think, unless you would have to, as an individual or as a family, practice that fiscal responsibility in your own home. And I think it puts us in a position of, possibly, if we have an emergency situation, having to like do wholesale layoffs in the middle of a school year. And what does that do to education and students? Because we have to divert money from another source in order to pay for a situation. So just in general, I can't imagine that the board or administration would advocate for that. So, I mean, that would be my thoughts about using fund balance. I don't think it's a good practice. I know it's very frowned upon, by, the associations that govern school system accountings, within the state of Maryland. And I just think it's a bad precedent to set, with the county, to say, we're not going to expect you to fund us. We're just going to take our, even if we did that, even if we spent every penny of the fund balance, we wouldn't have the budget needs for 2026.
Right, so it adds additional risk. So whatever
Right.
services you're providing with the current fund balance, you're not necessarily guaranteed to be able to provide the same level of supports or services in the next year or any of the follow-on years.
Correct. And the other thing is, you have to remember, is 85% of the school system's budget is made up of employee costs. It's salaries, it's healthcare, it's retirement, it's all of those things. There's only roughly 14 to 15% of the budget that's fungible. And to commit to, I mean, if I were representing the teachers union and I went into negotiations and I knew the school system was negotiating for salary increases with no plan to pay for them, that would be an enormous problem. Like, if you need to be in a position to meet those obligations on an ongoing basis, and you can't do that if you're paying people cost with fund balance, because fund balance will not be the same year after year. So just a really bad practice.
In the context of fund balance, one of the questions that I've always had and haven't really seen an answer to is, I'm assuming that from an accounting perspective, there's I'll say a recommended percentage that should be allocated to that, or as a target. What kind of number is that?
Hang on, Stephanie just asked me to go back one slide. My recollection, and this is, 6 years old, and my mind isn't what it used to be. I think it's somewhere around 10 to 12%. Wayne, does that sound right? And we've been between 2 and 5.
Yeah. So, it's a great question. And, for private industry, you'd be looking at a solid 10%. There's really no specific guidance for school systems. What's interesting is there's a lot more to this fund balance conversation, than what we're just discussing here. So, previously, the school systems had anywhere from, like Laura's mentioned, like maybe 1 to 2% to maybe up to 5. We were able to build up a fairly large fund balance over the COVID years, from fiscal 21, fiscal 22, um, because of a variety of factors. One, there was a lot of funds coming into the school system which were never available before from federal and state. And those funds had to be used for very specific things. But what's interesting is we were able to use those funds. Those were funds that were expired, that would expire if they weren't used. So those funds were used first, and they actually displaced funds that we had received from other funds that we received from the state and county, that we didn't have to use, that weren't tied, weren't expiring. So basically, we used up this additional state and federal money first, and we invested in the school system. We hired more people for more supports. We bought technology, but as a school system, HCPS was able to save on a percentage basis way more money than the other school systems in the state. So we actually had a very sizable fund balance, way more than any other school system had ever had, way more than we'd ever had before, HCPS has ever had before. And that was due to basically just being able to use the other money first, even though we were investing and getting our numbers back up, the student teacher ratios back up to where they should have been. We had 11 straight years going into 2020 where we lost personnel. 11 straight years in a row, we lost personnel because of underfunding from our county government, right? It can be directly tied to that. So, when COVID happened and all this money came in, that was an opportunity to kind of rebuild that workforce, and rebuild capability, and try to address the COVID loss. And then, so the schools, the board had this large fund balance. And when the current county executive administration came in, they pumped the brakes on the school system's budget, and they were actually allowed to one time go back and fund less than the previous year. That was 2 fiscal years ago. So that's what they did. They chose to do that. So that was the first time HCPS had ever been funded less than the previous year in at least modern times. And we were the only school system that suffered that, even though we had saved money, and we had invested carefully in resources. We were the only school system in Maryland that received less funding than the previous year, due to that one time. Basically, it was a blueprint artifact, legislation that was passed at the very end of the session that year that allowed school systems to recalculate their maintenance of effort. But our county executive was the only one that chose to fund the school system less than any other when compared to any other county. So because we had less funding that year, we did dip into the previous year, we did dip into fund balance some. And then last year, or I should say this current fiscal year, which ends the end of June, this coming June, we dipped in again, because again, we had invested carefully to rebuild the school system, and you want to maintain that momentum, right? The performance of the students, the performance of the school system, is the result of the investments that are put into the classroom. So it's important to maintain the momentum, particularly since with blueprint requirements coming up, it doesn't make any sense to get rid of staff. So, going into this coming budget season, what's been signaled, as Laura mentioned, is that the county executive has said that he's going to flat fund us again. So that was the message and got that loud and clear. But we used $30 million of fund balance last year. Plus our expenses go up about $30 million a year. And that's just from modest increases in salary for the entire system, increased pension costs, having to, buy new curriculum that is mandated by the state, and also to invest in other blueprint initiatives. So that is the reason why we need that. So that $60 million gap that we're looking at actually was shrunk to about 55 fairly quickly in this budget cycle. And what the superintendent plans to do at this point is actually cut that in half again. So we're looking at roughly a $30 million ask, additional $30 million ask from the county this year, above and beyond what we got last year. So roughly 30 million, which will put us roughly 20 to 25 million over where we were 3 years ago. And when you put that in context, there's a lot of research I need to do. So nobody's doing this research. Nobody's putting these numbers out. Nobody's collected this data. But what really needs to happen is a 5-year look back of all the counties, their increases from their county governments and state and whatnot, because no school system in Maryland is being funded the way HCPS is. Every school system is receiving increases from their county executive. What's interesting is Baltimore County just put out their request, which is they're asking for 6.5% more, which gets them to almost a $3 billion operating budget, 2.98 billion. Ours is roughly 700 million. To put that in context, now Baltimore County is roughly 2.5 times as big as HCPS, but yet their budget is 4 times.
Yeah, I think the way you look at that too, Wade, is you gotta look at the per pupil spending.
Exactly.
Because you can talk about like the giant numbers, and they are
Yes.
giant numbers, but where you see differences in performance is when you can zero down and explain, hey, and I'm making this number up, this is not true. Baltimore County is spending 18,000 per student, and we're spending 13, and that it makes a difference. That $5,000 a year per kid is a huge gap.
Particularly if revenues continue to increase into Harford County government. So,
right.
Not only from income taxes, but also property taxes, right? I mean, anybody that's seen their assessment, owns a house and seen their assessment this year, last year, you're seeing that the housing assessments are up roughly 20%. So that translates directly, phased in over 3 years, increased revenue to the county and state. In general, wages are up, income is up in Harford County. So there is significant increases in revenue coming into the county, yet we're still receiving less than we did, 2-3 years ago.
Right.
And of course, all of the expenses are going up for us. Next year, for instance, our electricity cost is going to go up roughly 30%, which is $3 million or roughly 30 teachers. That's just something the system's going to have to bear.
Okay. So, the state funding, as after 2020, those 5 areas that the blueprint focused on: early childhood education, which the big ticket item there is universal pre-K, which requires a lot of investment in both in capital as well as in hiring teachers. High quality and diverse teachers and leaders. Part of that initiative is that every first year teacher needs to be at a starting salary of $60,000 a year. From what I understand from Sean today, in order for us to be on target to do that on the timeline that the blueprint requires, would have required us to give a 2% COLA. And one of the ways that he is going to suggest trying to put forth a budget that is less than the system need is to reduce the amount in the negotiated packages. So I think we're looking at maybe more like a 1% COLA. And that means we would not be on target for first year teachers to be at 60. So that's something obviously we have to go back to the state and explain. And although a lot of the initiatives under the blueprint came with state funding, the presumption by the legislators when that was passed was that the county would throw in money to also support these initiatives, that the county funding source was also going to be committed to moving education forward in each county, and there would be a local funding cost to implement these various state requirements. That is happening in a lot of counties. It's not happening in Hartford County. So that's when we get to this conversation about the difference between what's called a funded mandate and an unfunded mandate. The blueprint is, overall was considered a funded mandate because it did come with state money, but there are components of it that now in Hartford County have become unfunded because we're still required to comply with them, but the county portion that the state assumed would be there is not. So that has also contributed to the situation that we find ourselves in with respect to the budget. The local portion is something like 778, and that for infrastructure and various costs that the county has not given us. That looks like it should be in the millions, right? Yeah, I think that number is off on my chart. I got to fix that. The other thing that the school system has in all of this is in their data on their website too, by the way, is that we have had a significant growth in special education students and their needs. And that also comes at a significant cost, hiring more highly trained special education teachers and a variety of other ways to support those students has increased the cost of our doing business in HCPS. All right, so that's all of the explanation of how we got to the situation we're in. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the budget request. 86.7% of our budget is instruction and transportation. As an aside, I think most people don't realize this. The school systems in Maryland are not required under state law to provide transportation for students. And it is, however, and I think, Wade might be able to talk a little bit more about this. I think that as the board has struggled with what to do about having reasonable budget, there have been conversations about cutting the budget request, what would cuts look like? But also, and my board struggled with this too, can we provide new revenue sources internally through the system? Could you save a lot of money if you cut transportation? Sure. Does that disproportionately affect certain student communities? Absolutely. Do you want students who already struggle to get to school not to have transportation and the opportunity to get to the classroom? Probably not. I don't know that if I was on the board, I could vote for that. Charging for athletics, my board is the one that charged for the plays, or I don't even remember how we did it, but it was a mess. Again, it disproportionately affects specific students and not others. So it creates an enormous challenge to try to look for, ways to create income streams. And you have to also ask yourself, is this going to be a one-time savings? If you stop charging for transportation, you get some of those savings over time. Sure, you're going to save on gas, but once there's going to be a point at which those savings level out and they no longer are savings anymore. So they don't create income, for more than a year, maybe a couple years. And now that revenue source is gone. So you're always going to be operating at a deficit if that is the way you try to approach the budget. And I think as Wade pointed out, and as I pointed out, the strategy is going to be to create a budget that has less than an ideal request, but one the system will have to figure out how to make work. And that budget would likely include cuts to positions. And it's my understanding there will definitely be cuts to position in central office, although I will tell you we are still, if not the lowest, among the very lowest in the state of Maryland in central office positions. The
We are the lowest.
legislative services stopped counting that. Did you realize that, Wade? There's no data after 2022 on that.
There's a lot of data missing, actually.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yes.
So there will be cuts to central office. There will be cuts that affect the classroom, and there will be, my guess is, a reduced proposed salary package for employees. The consequence to that, again, I had the board in 19 that had to cut 173 teaching positions. And also we cut the salary package. You know, there are other counties that will be able to do their full negotiated package, and we will lose teachers to neighboring jurisdictions. Probably not Cecil County, because my guess is they're not keeping up either because of their problems with their government, but Baltimore County for sure. So that is kind of where I think the budget's going to fall out, or the proposal. Wade, do you have any thoughts or anything you want to add or correct or?
Yeah. So, it's crazy how deep we are into this budget cycle already, and where we're ending up. It's definitely ongoing. Nothing's settled. But the superintendent is very close to providing his proposed budget to us. It is definitely a reduced ask from where we are now. There definitely are position cuts. There's no, across the board. There's no, plan for, eliminating people. It's just positions. And the number of positions that are being proposed to be cut are well within our natural attrition, just a percentage of natural attrition. So really no, employee should fear, losing their the ability to work for HCPS, although some folks will probably have to shift, but that'll just be a small number really. But there's, I mean, we have just pulled this budget apart, looking at all different things that could possibly be saved without kind of taking away what folks really look to as being education. Like you mentioned, transportation. We're required to provide transportation for any student with special needs. But beyond that, like you said, we're not required to do that. And if we decided to get rid of transportation for those students, that would be a $38 million savings for this year. I don't think there's any appetite for that. But there are board members who are absolutely interested in getting rid of anything that's not required by law, and or finding a way to charge to make them budget neutral. And there's many things that the school system just does. And again, Maryland's trying to build the best school system in the country. That's the goal. The goal is not to cut education. The goal is not to take things away from the community. But yet here we are in this county dealing with those choices. So, the ask is going to come very quickly, and then there will be input from the community, and then we'll have to eventually send that budget over to the county executive, and then he will come back with whatever he decides to fund, and then it will go to the county council, and they, at that point, I don't know, I'm sorry, am I getting ahead of what?
It's okay. You're a little bit ahead, but we'll get there. Renee
Why don't I
raised her
stop then?
hand in the chat. So Renee, what's your question?
So, in this training, you've talked about continued cuts to the school system, and reduced positions. I think Wade said up to 11 years of continued position cuts through 2020. I guess my question is, and this is something that I have struggled with, and maybe if you have any thoughts on this, is how do you have any idea on how parents especially, right? So not everybody in Harford County has children in the school system, but for the for the families who do, how do we measure impacts associated with the cuts? Like what are some ideas that you have in being able to say, you know, like, what do you recommend? Do you recommend a journal for people? Like, my kid has this now. I have a kid coming up in 2 years. Like, this is like, how do you make it tangible? That's one of the challenges that I've had personally with my children's time in the school system. It's hard to measure what those impacts are. Which I think makes it difficult to advocate for more money.
Right. So this is interesting because this is a conversation, I think, Renee, it's a little bit of a continuation of a conversation we had at our last board meeting, which are some of these impacts are visible to a parent when they walk into a classroom, which means they show up, I don't know, for any event and they can count the heads in the room and see that their kids in a larger classroom than they were the year before. But there are others that aren't visible to parents, not because the system is trying to, hide them, but some of the positions that potentially end up cut. And I know like my board we cut all of the math. Oh gosh, I'm having a senior memo where I can't remember the name of what the position was, but they were math coaches. And the math coaches were actually, they weren't teaching positions in a classroom teaching. They were math coaches for teachers. They were there to help teachers differentiate within their classroom based on students' abilities and what their student body looked like. We had positions for first year teachers. We had administrative positions that were part of the school-based employees. They were school-based employees, but they didn't have their own dedicated classroom. Instead, they were coming in and out of classrooms, providing additional supports either for the teachers or students, or doing pull out with students. And those types of positions are not as visible to parents because they're not sitting in the classroom all day long watching what goes on. So I think it's fair to say that when you watch or see or attend a board meeting and you see the budget presentation and the request, and there's a conversation around how many positions are going to be cut, and just because we don't know who will view this later, I want to be clear for those people who maybe, what is the difference between people being cut and positions being cut? What Wade meant by that is that we have more retirements generally at the end of every school year than probably the positions that we will have to cut. So that's what he's saying. Like nobody's walking into, any specific school and saying, teacher A, you're not going to be here next year. They're going to give to each principal a number of positions they get per grade level, and then the principal is going to figure out, who they have coming back and whether they're hiring or not hiring, and if they can hire, where can they move that person within the system or within their building, based on the positions they've been given. So that's what he means by positions, not people. I would say that it's fair to really specifically ask and send emails or attend meetings and just say, can you give us, a real understanding of what the impact is on the average classroom when you have to make these cuts to positions?
I was going to say, follow
Yes.
up on that. One of the thoughts, is there I'll say a chart or a table somewhere that basically says, here's what HCPS believes is the fully funded, moving forward requirement. Here's what we're asking for given our budget. That'd be one column. And here's what we're asking for, in our budget given the constraints that we've been told we got to deal with. and then a third column, which is here's the impact of that delta. So that you end up with, I don't know what level of granularity you would want to go to, but the idea being that, if you have to cut the math advisors, you can say, well, we really should have, 12 of them. We're only going to have 3, and here's how it impacts the education. Is there a table or something like that people can reference?
I
There
don't know
will be.
that there is yet
Yeah.
because I think the superintendent has to make his proposal and then the board has to pass it. But I wouldn't be surprised if there was something like that, Wade. What do you think? I mean, I think
Yeah, that'll
Ball
be
seems to be
coming. But
very committed to being
yeah,
transparent and communicative.
yeah, and actually, he's shared a bunch. Like he had 2 budget sessions um, before the holidays, or I should say between. It was in December, um, and he was very transparent to the high level. And this is still being figured out, and not all positions will be figured out, and some may say we're losing 10 of this or 10 of this type of position, but then depending on how student enrollment goes, we may only be able to, they may end up only eliminating 8 of this, that type of thing, because there's always the shifting um, student, populations, some in some degree, and more so in some communities than others. So the needs do change, and they can change quickly as the new year starts. It won't be like a hard and I'm sure it will never be hard and fast, like this is exactly what we're doing. But it's going to be close, and that'll come out soon, I would think.
Okay.
And I was thinking, I mean, I don't know if anybody else on the line has experienced this, but I don't recall like anybody ever say, so we get notices like when we have student teachers, right, come into the classroom, but I don't ever recall a process, especially in elementary school, where it's like, I am your teacher, and these are all of the people who will support your child throughout the year. So, that could be an opportunity to measure that. I just feel like after it's been implemented, it's hard.
Mhm.
It's kind of like, well, this is what we work with. And it's hard to go back and say, this is what we
Ah,
lost. It's kind of like, well, this is where we are. So let's not look back. Let's keep moving forward. And I agree with that to some extent, but at the same time, in order to understand the impacts or potential impacts, especially for younger families.
yeah,
I
I mean, those are good suggestions, Stephanie.
had a question. If you could speak to the split, or if we can put a question out there for clarity on when you say diversion to other areas, how the commitment to Hartford Community College has played into some of the budget shortfall for HCPS.
Yeah, I have not examined that, but I can look at the
And
um
then
Do you mean
other
like dual enrollment?
revenues, like we all talk about revenues and the fund balance. As you do the research, wade through the other counties, I mean, I can tell you from just in speaking with other counties that, obviously their revenues are a lot different. They're a lot bigger. Um, I'd be curious to see what their fund balance, how they carry it. I mean, I definitely know, Laura, when you were advocating, the fund balance was used for like the increase in health costs. So, I mean,
yeah.
I understand exactly what you're saying about the fund balance. I agree with you 100% about not depleting that in order for true emergencies. So I don't agree with like, just use your fund balance. But again, there has to be a way above and beyond um, just going from, hey, we need $60 million. I mean, I was tracking some of the Baltimore County and the way that they were presenting their budgets. I mean, they're getting rid of perks like cell phone use. They're getting rid of 119 central office people. And I know you mentioned that you're pretty lean in central office. I'm not alluding to that, but um, I think in general, the big question is, and it always has been when I was advocating for use benefit to be built, when you go to people's homes that do not have kids, where would we get the money? Like, is it time for Hartford Community College to increase their fees to local students, to out of county students? Is there a way? There's other practices in other states that, Hartford County, if we're not going to meet the 60,000 for starting salaries, you give tax incentives off of their property or some type of thing to give them an outside incentive. Like, let's start talking to the legislative body about that, or the county executive for that, because this is not new. And across the board, we see electricity going. Granted, the HCPS has more buildings than most, but across the county, government service buildings are going to have increased electric bills. They're going to have increased costs. Like, that's just general across. And Hartford County as a whole does not want to increase taxes. You've got county council people fighting about impact fees increasing on new development. So we're constantly fighting ways to bring in revenue. So I just don't know how we can talk practically. Renee, I remember when the cuts went out, like Laura was saying, we did lose two teachers. Now, I say lose, they were transferred to Edgewood. They were transferred out of the system, but didn't lose their job, but it decreased services, classes for the Falston High School.
Mhm.
I remember that. So it does impact you, but you're not going to know it unless you're in the classrooms. And that is a
Or
hard
unless
thing.
you know to go to your principal or send an email and say, can you tell me what you're like?
And a lot of the principals, when I dealt with that, will not release that information
Yep,
until you're in summer because they are trying to figure out, again, like Wade
right.
said, what's the population coming in? Where am I getting these students? What teachers do I have to teach those classes? Like, there was a huge shift in like the daycare education at Falston. Yeah, so that's a challenging one because I remember Mr. Jester saying, Stephanie, don't go out and say we're not going to have foreign languages next year. You know what I mean? I can't stick my neck on the line. So that's going to be hard to convey other than relaying past information unless Dr. Bolson gives you something solid. Because again, what I find hard is to sit there and say, we're going to lose 119 teachers when Wade, you just nailed it and you said, well, but 115 of those were really going to retire anyway. Like, why can't we just give
Well,
kudos that, like, you know what I mean? Like, that is very misleading. And that's when I'm out in the community now, because I'm like an empty nester with the schools. Um, they're like, well, see, now you're paying for it. And I said, I don't mind paying for education, but then they bring that up like, well, they said that last year and then they figure it out. They do this every year. And so it's really hard to combat those things without hard
So can we
numbers. I
pause
mean, it's
there?
easy.
There's so much to unpack in what you just said, and I want to address everything. So let's start from the top. So the first thing you started talking about was the Harvard Community College. So I just want to ask, what specifically were you talking about? What I don't
Well,
understand.
because their funding comes from that pot of money, correct?
You mean so HCC? Yes, HCC does have some funding from Harvard County government.
Correct. And so in whole, that money, like the transfer tax and all that, it's in that pot of money where it's ag preservation and education type of things. And so
Oh,
that,
yeah. So okay. So let's unpack. Let's just pause there. So what we've been talking about this entire time has been, for the most, really 99% of it has been the operating budget.
mhm.
And there are two totally separate budgets. There's a capital budget, which pays for, maintaining our buildings, doing small renovations, and then it goes all the way up to school replacements and brand new schools, that type of thing. That's the capital side. But we've been talking about operating. So talking about you bring up transfer taxes, recordation taxes. and then impact fees. You mentioned that as well a little while ago. All of those particular, revenue sources only go to capital projects. And they go to they can be applied to capital projects in very specific ways. And we can talk about that if we want to, but really what we're talking about is operating. So, the general fund that Harford County has from property taxes and income taxes, really, because I don't think any of the Maryland sales tax passes through to Harford County. It's just income and property tax. That's what funds, the Harford County Public Schools, a piece of the Harford County Public Schools budget, and then a piece of HCC's budget, operating budget, but the rest also comes from, the tuition fees, and then the libraries, the operating of the libraries.
I agree. I'm tracking with all that. I get it.
Did that make it clearer, or does that make it muddier?
No,
Yeah.
I agree with everything you just said. My whole point is that we have to increase money going to one bucket to decrease it in another. I know they're completely separate, and I get that.
Yeah.
I have no doubt for that.
Well, actually, no. So here's the thing. We're now in the third year of the current administration. We're going into the third budget cycle, and again, our school system is receiving less money now than before he took office. So Harford County has had basically a holiday from increased costs of the school system for the last 2 years, now going into the third year of the budget. So what does that mean? So every year, the revenue coming into Harford County grows by roughly 5%. More income taxes, more property taxes. It's actually growing a little faster than that, but let's just use 5%. So this year, it's roughly, it's close to $1 billion. So roughly $50 million more revenue is going to come into Harford County government this year due to increased taxes. Typically, the school system gets close to half, but now we're down to 37%. Now, just the school system we're down to 37%. Our budget the money that's provided to the school system for operating represents 37%, as Laura showed, of the of Harford County's government, of Harford County's revenue. What's interesting is other counties, the operating budget represents up to 60% of the revenue coming in. Like Anne Arundel County, 60% of the income and property taxes that come in go to the operating budget of their school system. That's one of the reasons why they can have magnet programs for their middle schools. So it's a choice. It is clearly a choice in this county by the county executive and supported by the county council, of course, that our funding is so low from the county side. There doesn't need to be any increased taxes. There doesn't need to be any reduction in funds provided to the sheriff, to the libraries, to EMS, to you name it, the health department. We don't need to reduce that at all.
Well, that right there then would be the speaking points to the community then. And
it's a choice. Yeah.
And not just choice, but you tell them exactly, because that is exactly what you will hear. So I'm going to ask this question. So in the budget request, the 60 million, would any of that money go into the capital funding for HCPS?
No, that's totally separate.
They can't use it. They can't use operating budget request for capital.
But I mean, there's no budget request in there for the 60 million. It's just straight operating costs.
So the 60 million, it's not going to be a $60 million ask. It's going to be roughly half that.
I know, but let's just keep on in line. I'm just saying, because it's confusing. And so again, the people outside, and I get the impact fees, like it's new construction and all, but they sit there and say, well, we're going to build this new school, a Harford Academy, and all this stuff. So they have their money, in general. So they don't quite understand, they being citizens that come to like the elderly citizens, and they're like, they don't need any more money. They already get 50% of the budget. So
Well, they don't. We don't get 50%. We're getting
but that, I'm
37.
just saying, telling you what's on the street is like, so to
There's a lot of
educate,
misinformation. There's a lot
right.
of
So to
misinformation. I would say
educate people on the
disinformation from the
street
county.
that don't have kids in the system is what I'm saying is that they don't care if I walk in and be like, you know what, my kid, there weren't 3 Spanish classes and there were 30 kids in a class. It's a hard argument for me to advocate for. So, and then you go at it and they're like, well, if they get 60 million, my library is going to close and I won't have my classes at the rec center and I won't. So I'm trying to figure out not only internally how to give parents that, and then because a lot of parents don't want to speak about it because then they get shut down from other people. Like it's easy to advocate within the school system, be like, oh my gosh, we won't have turf grass or whatever. You know what I mean? Like when I
Well,
know that's capital improvement, but it's
can I just say one thing too, Stephanie, about the capital, and then we'll get off of this, but you know this, but I'll say it so other people will know. We have 54 buildings. They each have a life cycle of approximately 50 years. Use benefit, we opened that school in 17. We opened Haverty Grace, what, 2 years ago, Wade? Is it 2 or 3?
Roughly 2, 3.
8. Homestead Wakefield's going to be what, another 2-year build
No, actually, this fall it'll open up this fall.
Okay. So we're opening or replacing a building or doing a major renovation roughly every 3 years. We should be doing 1.25 schools every year. But Glassman cut the capital budget by exactly the amount he added to operating when he did it. And we are behind on capital projects.
Yeah, that's a totally different.
That's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah.
right.
But when people have that make those statements, they're just wrong.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
just repeating wrong misinformation, and it may be truly what they believe, but it's not accurate.
Like for instance, our county executive right now is touting the fact that it's costing $87 million to build a Homestead Wakefield, as if like Harford County wrote a check for $87 million. Well, that didn't happen because Harford County didn't write a penny for the most part. So what happens is the entire construction cost, or I should say Harford County's piece of the construction cost, goes on bonds, right? It's a mortgage, basically. And Harford County, a long time ago, decided to use 20-year mortgages. Most school systems use 30-year bonds. So because we have chosen to go the 20-year bond route, we only have so much appetite for how much debt we can take on at a time. Because as you know, if you have a 15-year versus 30-year mortgage, the payments are much higher on a 15-year mortgage. So the payments are higher on the 20-year bonds, much higher. So, and those are serviced by first recordation taxes and the transfer taxes and the piece that can be serviced by impact fees. But our impact fees, even after the increase this month ago, are still less than what the state of Maryland allows us to apply them for. So then it actually only costs about $10 million a year out of the general funds to service the bonds that are taken out to replace schools and to do the major renovations. Like for instance, we have a major renovation right now at Harvard Tech. There's another major renovation happening at Sewell and Wright. We're talking major renovations. These are tens of millions of dollars. I believe Harvard Tech is like 40 to 50 million, and C Milton is like $40 million, something like that, renovation. These all go in bonds. So it's actually not coming out of like this year's budget. It's only roughly costing about $10 million in the general. I realize $10 million is a lot of money, but we have 55 buildings, right? So, when you're only replacing a building every other year, you're at over 100-year replacement cycle. Now, some buildings we have are over 100 years old and they're still functioning just fine. But in general, not all buildings are going to perform that way. And certainly they don't have the spaces that are necessary to teach the way we teach now with more differentiation, small groups, that type of thing. It's a real challenge. So to Laura's point, we really do to have the most effective school system that we can have, we really should look at replacing schools more often than we are. Um, but that is really another piece of it.
Okay. But I don't disagree with you, Stephanie. I understand that people who are living on fixed incomes and no longer have students in the classroom or never had students in the classroom are less inclined to argue in favor of fully funding the school system budget. It's a lot of money. It goes up every year, and people have a hard time understanding why. What are those variables? So, I mean, the best thing we can do is try to, educate people. And I want to get off the Capitol because that's not really what we're talking about. But I will say, we were halfway through getting the council to give us support for youth benefit. And in the middle of that, the state came out with legislation to increase the percentage that the county was going to have to pay for capital projects from 58% to 63%. And Slutsky was then council president, and he said, "There's no way I'm not going to spend it. You're not getting your school." And what do you do as community members or PTA members when you know you need the building replaced? Kids are sick, teachers are sick. It's not a safe place. And the county's fight argument with you is the state's not giving us enough money. We're not willing to pay for it. It's an impossible situation.
Yeah, Baltimore County is replacing 5 schools right now at a time. That's above and beyond their major renovations that they're doing. I mean, I realize that they're 2.5 times bigger than us, but they're replacing basically 3 to 4 times as fast as we are. We're just falling behind.
So do you have any recommendations
Well,
on
I
what
think
specifically we should be advocating for?
So right now it's operating. It's only
Yeah.
operating budget. Capital is not a thing.
Right. But in terms of this presentation, like what should we be advocating for? So we advocate for the superintendent's budget, but how do we make it real to people? Because I think when you implement changes based on reduction, it's hard to measure. It's hard to understand what that impact is just as a citizen of Harford County.
Well, I would say, looking at this slide, obviously, it takes time and it's hard because families have a limited amount of time outside of their own family dynamic to spend all this time engaging in other meetings. But fully understanding the process, who can help you, sharing this once you get this recorded, available to people so people can watch it when they have the opportunity, hopefully understand a little bit more about the budget and what the needs are and what's happening and what the impact is. And then, we have here at the end of this, the various parties and decision makers in the process, when they're engaged in it, what their role is, how they're limited, and what each PTA member or as a group, PTA as a whole, can do to try to influence. And then the other thing I think I sent to you, Renee, which isn't on here, is there is a contact spreadsheet that's been updated to reflect the most recent elections. In all of our decision makers that affect Harford County, the delegation, the council, the board, how to reach the county executive. And so I would say watch Monday's meeting, or if you don't watch it on Monday, watch it after Monday. The superintendent is going to present to the board his recommendation. So you fully understand what he's going to ask for in the budget from the county and what he is going to cut in order to make a smaller ask. And then, clearly reach out to the county executive and say, it's not what the system needs, but it's what the system will figure out how to live with, and we need you to fund it. And then once the county executive presents his budget, you need to go to the council at that point. Now, last year, I believe, is that the year, Wade, that with a lot of pressure from the council, they were able to get 10 million added by the county executive? Is that the 2025 budget?
No, so
Oh.
So the first budget for Castley, I believe, was our fiscal year 24, which would have been
Right,
not this current school year, but the previous school year. And
right.
for that year, due to the legislation that allowed counties to lower the MOE, to recalculate the MOE, the law basically would have allowed the county executive to fund the school system $20 million less than the previous year.
That's right.
So
He took advantage of that gap. Yep, I remember now.
So-
Okay.
So that was his original proposal. He said, "This is what I'm doing. I am funding you to the letter of the law, $20 million less than the previous year." Due to pressure from a variety of sources, he agreed to just decrease it by 10 million instead of 20 million. So for fiscal year 24, we lived with $10 million less from the county government than the previous year. The current year that we're in, he suggested that he first proposed for quite a long time that he was going to fund us exactly the way he funded the previous year, which would be considered flat funding. Okay. And then after pressure from the county council and other sources, but county council, he agreed to give $6 million more to the school system. So we are still roughly $4 million less than 3 years ago, okay, at this point. And then, of course, going into next year, this next budget cycle, he has signaled a flat funding again, but we will see how that ends up.
So I will
So
say,
can we use what you just referenced with that? Because since it's close, can we use that to say what happened in the classrooms this past year then? Like
Well,
obviously the initiatives of the lack of the 4 million in the first ask would be what we can reference.
we used so there was hiring freeze. We did not add positions, except for special education. We actually had to keep adding special education because that is growing so fast. But we used fund balance to plug the hole. Again, this was operational savings. I mean, you can argue whether fund balance should be used for this or not, but the fund balance came from operational savings. It actually came from operational money. Typically, fund balance should be used only for one-time expenses, like because we're way underfunded on capital side of things. Typically, fund balance gets applied to capital needs of the school system. Like for instance, over the last, I think it's 10 or 15 years, there's a separate capital budget. The average actual funding of the capital request for all the different capital improvements that we need around the school system just to maintain, like HVAC systems or new sidewalks or, new playground or whatever it is, we've only received 13% of the capital budget request on average over roughly the last dozen years or so. Okay. So obviously that doesn't pay the bills. That doesn't keep the school system going when we're only getting 13% of what's actually needed. So then those capital requests either get bumped. We just hope that HVAC will live. Although it's foolish with the expense and the complexity and uniqueness of certain things in the school system to wait until they die, because then they become serious emergencies. But typically, we would be using fund balance from the operational budget to pay for unfunded capital needs in the school system. And that's what we have done. We've done that every year as well. But we were plugging holes with operational savings from the COVID years. Now that is running short. Now we're only at roughly a $26 million fund balance, unassigned, I should say, fund balance going into this fiscal year. And I believe the superintendent's going to suggest using roughly 10 million of that. Previously, the school system only had maybe $5 million in fund balance. Well, I've talked to, we go to conferences, we meet with other school systems. I remember talking specifically to the Anne Arundel County superintendent 2 years ago, and I asked, "Well, where's your fund balance at?" He said, "Oh, we don't have any fund balance." And that's basically across the board. Like we're pretty unique that we have any real fund balance, because the other school systems, they literally just spend it. Like, I mean, they have needs and they just apply it. If they have money, they apply it to those needs. Whereas we're actually run much more conservatively. And that is what has resulted in that fund balance.
Okay, so Renee, you had a question? You have your hand raised.
Yeah, so there's a question in the chat about do you have any guidance on or training that, so I know that Dr. Bolson is going to be presenting the operating budget. But for any of the budget, right, the capital budget is less advertised. And Stephanie made a comment that we go through this cycle every year. So is there any training or guidance that you can provide on how PTAs and PTSAs can create a statement, either from their boards or the general membership, to share a message of, depending on the body or depending on the ask. PTAs and PTSAs are made up of individuals. What are some suggestions on what individuals ask for? Is it, what's important to them? There's been a lot of advocacy about keeping school open. Is the advocacy centered toward, enduring education, smaller classrooms? Do you have any suggested, any thoughts on targeted advocacy, from a PTA perspective, but also from an individual perspective? What should the asks be?
So that's great.
Wade, do you want to answer that, or do you want me to answer that? It's up to you.
We can both. I mean, I certainly have some ideas, but do you want to go first?
Okay. Well, let me go back and say one thing. This conversation about the council, I would like to say, is a big improvement over what my board dealt with, which was a council that kept saying, we can't do anything. And just so you know, when you look at this slide, if you want to go back and look at some of these slides and take your time, you can see that it's specific as to what limitations are. And for people who may not be aware, the county council cannot add any revenue to the budget. They can move monies around within the budget. But until the last few years, they've been very unwilling even to push the county executive. So the fact that they're willing to say, no, you got to give the school system more in the budget before the budget is released or even after is an improvement from what we've had in the past. So, I would say this: if I was advocating in front of the superintendent and or the board, I would say, we know you're going to need to make cuts, but please make the fewest cuts that affect the student in the classroom that you can make. Now, I know the superintendent's already thought that through, and that would be his goal. But clearly, the goal here is to retain highly qualified teachers and have the least impact on the student experience in the classroom. And that means, you want them in a classroom that is a manageable size with teachers who are qualified and can meet the students' needs. The goal of education, the goal of Harford County Public Schools, as long as I've been engaged, has always been to meet the needs of every student. It is almost an impossible task, but it should always be what we're aiming to do, right? Because, education is the great leveler in society. If you have a society that is well educated and this is what I say to the people who stop me who don't want to add money to education in Hartford County, is, if you really want to ruin this county, why don't you just dumb down the citizenship a little bit more by not providing appropriate education? So, I would ask for the cuts that have to be made to have the least impact as possible in the classroom and on the student. And then for the county council, I would ask them to put pressure on the county executive to offer a fair budget that allows us to have, a highly competitive and high functioning school system. I mean, that to me is what hopefully we're all looking for, whether we have kids in schools and I don't anymore, or we don't. You know, you want to give kids every opportunity they can have to excel and succeed. And it's not just because it benefits them or their parents or their family. It benefits us as a community to have a highly educated, citizenry. So I think that I'm sure I can find some statements that we have used in the past. I know I've written them. If PTAs are looking for some guidance and want some support with that, I would be happy to put some things together. So those are my thoughts. Wade?
Yeah, so all good there. So I have a couple of very specific things to suggest. First, I would suggest engaging with your county council person and also the county council president. I don't think that PTAs in general engage with them or invite them to their meetings. I think it would be outstanding if they would consider, attending, one meeting, your individual PTA's meeting to, discuss these things. Also, the county executive, just engaging with him directly, asking for a meeting, go to his office and meet with him. But in our budget, I'm not privy to everything that's going to be released yet. I couldn't share it anyway. It's not public, but there's probably going to be specific cuts. And if the county executive doesn't really, if the county executive doesn't meet us where we are going to be with this budget, depending on how significantly below, there's going to be some significant cuts that are definitely going to be it's going to be noticed. Like there's going to be programs that are being cut. There's going to be, more teachers cut. There's going to be things cut out of the school system. But we'll see if that happens. So that's where you need to pay attention to specifically what is going to be cut out. Like one of the suggestions is, it's always on the chopping block, typically when there's budget crisis, is Harper Glen. Shutting down Harper Glen. And you may not be familiar with that. Some folks, depending on where they are in the school system, well, what is that? But that's just one example. The pools, shutting those down. Charging athletic fees, eliminating fourth grade music. Excuse me. Just different things that are on the potential chopping block. I don't think they're going to be suggested at this point, but it could happen if the county executive doesn't come up with where our ask is going to be. So those are the things that you want to advocate for, specifically, if it comes to that.
So, Wade, there's a question in the chat that you might be able to answer. I don't know the answer to, but that is, how big a role does the parent survey play in deciding what cuts are going to be proposed or made?
Yeah, parent feedback is so critical. That's where I come from. I'm a parent. I'm just a dad, in the community. So I get it, and I think that parent feedback is very much listened to. That's critical. Like if there's a specific, if we take out, let's say, 25 elementary school positions, and that leads to your elementary school specifically losing one teacher in a grade, then, you would want to advocate for that, right? Because you're going to have, that whatever that equates to, however more students per classroom. But beyond that, that is one of those things that, like losing teacher position, what is that really going to equate to? Are we actually losing curriculum? Like, are we going to lose, let's say, in eighth grade now across all middle schools, we have foreign language. Are we going to lose that? Probably not. Although some board members are looking at that, but I keep telling them, well, we have to fill the student's day up with something, right? None of those students are going out on work study in eighth grade. So it's the same number of teachers, so why would we get rid of that? So like Renee has been saying, it's difficult sometimes to quantify. But when there's specific things that are lost, that's what we have to fight for.
Thank
Did
you.
that
I
answer
guess,
the question? I'm sorry, did that answer the question?
yeah, it did. And I guess I'm thinking back also to that survey that was sent out to the parents, I want to say in the fall, just asking for input on, if you had to choose between this or this, what would you choose to cut essentially? So I didn't know. And obviously that's only an if it needs to be cut, right? And you can't do
Yeah.
all of them because it comes down at the end, if this is more expensive than this, you can't do everything, obviously, that everybody wants. So I was thinking back to that, but it does answer the question. So thank you.
Yeah. So specifically about that, I know that Sean, our superintendent, has been really impressed with the feedback. And the folks that are close to that have been really thankful for all the feedback that's been given. So that's really important. So it's definitely gonna help guide the decision making process. But I guess what I was saying was the more specific you can make your responses. Now, there I'm talking about if you write the board, if you email the board, or email the superintendent or the county executive or the county council, the more specific you can make the request, the more tangible it is, and I think the more impactful it is.